Howdy folks, welcome to week 11 research methods. Once again, your instructor, Dr. Gabriel Sines. This week, we'll be taking a look at qualitative methods. Now, because most of research in psychology is going to be quantitative, this section is going to be pretty brief. There are some things we're going to be talking about that take a lot of time to do, but there's not a lot that you need to learn in order to be able to use qualitative methods other than just knowing what they are. Depending on the type of qualitative that you work with, you might learn a lot more um, in the process of using it, but as long as you're familiar with what options you have in qualitative research, that's going to be more than enough for the purposes of this class. So we're going to have kind of a shorter class this week. Once again, the material should be interesting, the activities should be exciting and engaging, but hopefully shouldn't take too much of your time this time around. Let's start by first just revisiting what is qualitative research. Now, we've worked mostly in the realm of quantitative research. Quantitative research is pretty much any research that involves numbers and analyses. Qualitative research is not using analyses, and that's kind of vague. A lot of people like to use qualitative research because it feels as though it should be easy. You don't need to use statistics. But that's really not the case. With qualitative research, you actually might need to put in way more time as an individual to get to where you're trying to go. What choices do you have in qualitative research? Well, the easy answer is that you're going to be using interviews. But there are more than just interviews available to you. Now, within interviews, you're going to have examples or different options of things that you can do. Of course, examples of qualitative research include interviews like the stuff you get on 2020 or on 60 Minutes. Interviews about a person's life, about something that happened to them or that happened to a friend of theirs. Interviews can range almost any extent of topics, and there's a lot of variability in what you can do with an interview. One thing you're going to be one thing that you're going to want to be careful about with qualitative interviews is that you are dealing with people, and so the information you get from them might be the most accurate it could possibly be because you're directly asking a person for their opinion, and if their opinion is what you want, then that's exactly what you're looking for. But it could also be a little bit rough. For example, how well can a person describe an event that they've been in? Of course, they can remember what happened, but can you trust their memory? If it was a scary event, if it was something that happened a long time ago, if it was something that happened to a friend, they may not be able to give you perfect details, even if they know what happened, even if they're confident in what they say, they might not be totally correct. Another thing, too, is that when you interview someone, the information they give you is never going to be totally devoid of personal opinions. And so all of those problems are going to be constant, not just for interviews, but for any sort of qualitative research. A couple more examples of choices or options you have in qualitative research include historical documents, looking up books people have written, journals, government information, facts that they just wrote down to keep down, tax documents, trade documents, receipts, and of course archaeology as well. And by archaeology, I just mean anything where you're looking for information from physical means. So you could look at the way a city is laid out and tell what parts of the city were most important or most affluent. You could look at the way that a piece of furniture is made and learn more about the culture or about the people who made it or about the people who used it based off of the way the furniture is made. And so that's what I mean by archaeology. It is still qualitative research because you're really not going to be gathering numeric data, but you're going to be gathering word-based data, talk-based data there. Okay, so what sections have we got in this chapter? The first section is going to be the longest, sources of qualitative data. It's just going to highlight what options you have or just give you some suggestions on what types of qualitative data you could gather. Historical data, so that's going to be kind of the archaeology and documents section. Case studies, that's going to be working with one person or a small group of people over a very long period of time. Finally, we'll take a look at posters and conferences. Doesn't necessarily belong in this section, but it is part of research. The posters and conferences section will give you an idea of how people talk to each other about their research when they put together a poster or when they go to a conference and talk about their research. So brief sections, but nonetheless important sections. Let's get started with what sources of qualitative data may be. What are people saying and how do they say it? Of course, we've got historical documents. Examples of historical documents might be like the Magna Carta, which is a government political decree, or the Complaint Tablet to E.A. Nasir. That is one that I love. It is a tablet where someone is complaining about a trade that they made with a person named E.A. Nasir. The guy had promised good quality metal ingots, and what he delivered was not good quality metal ingots. And so he says, "You treated my servant." This guy says, "You treated my servant poorly. I want to have my money back. You need to give it back." And so it kind of shows. It can show you so much, not just about the writing and about the economy of the time, but also how people spoke to each other, how their culture worked, how they treated each other. We actually learn about how their relationship was to their slaves there. And the slave that they have depicted in that tablet, I believe, is actually almost like a high profile secretary. They were a respected person because they belonged to a high profile trader. And so there's so much that we can learn from these. And so if you wanted to learn about the culture in this time, you could go to this document, and even though it's about trade, you can learn from inferences there. And so that would be qualitative data as well. All right, so physical artifacts, there are so many different ways that we can gather data from physical artifacts. The first we've got on the left are the bodies of Pompeii. So you may know that there was a civilization on the island of Pompeii that was destroyed when a volcano suddenly erupted and covered the whole island in really hot ash. But what this also did is that it immediately it kind of encased all of the people on that island in the ash, and so we can actually see what they looked like and where they were uh, at the time of their deaths and what they were doing. So here we've got a plaster mold of a dog, and he actually, scientists were able to tell that he had a collar on him. Or her, and there are a lot more statues of this, but we can actually learn about people were how people would interact with each other, how they talked to each other, how they lived, what sort of people lived in different places, and what they did in their day-to-day lives. Next up on the right, we have actually recently bit of news. So a soldier's room was kept totally untouched for 100 years. I have actually got a link to that at the end of this PowerPoint if you want to learn more about that situation. And so, of course, this is an artifact where we can learn about what life was like at the time from this soldier's room. Now, just the last little section here on qualitative data is talking to people. And we have a couple of different ways that we can talk to people and get data or information from people. Of course, interviews. If you look up online, the most famous interview or the most viewed interview in the entire world is going to be the interview that Oprah Winfrey did with Michael Jackson. And we've talked briefly about that already. Another thing that's a little bit more interesting that you may not be familiar with is the concept of a participant observer. So a participant observer is someone who participates in an event or in a group of people or who was in a situation at a time, and they're tasked with gathering data, remembering, watching what's going on, and figuring out trying to report that information. So the example I've got here is from a book called Nickel and Dime. It's a book that I had to read when I was in middle school and once again in high school. It's a book about a lady who is trying to learn what it's like to be a poor person or a lower class citizen in the United States. And she worked as a waitress, she worked as an employee at Walmart, and she worked at another job as well. I don't remember exactly what she did, but she basically showed that it was almost impossible to make it as a poor person in America. And this is in the 90s. She talked about how the amount of money that people make in these entry-level jobs was just absurd, and that these entry-level jobs cause people to incur medical expenses. They get physically harmed in their jobs doing these physical labor jobs, and that those medical expenses are not something that they can take care of with the pay that they're given. That you almost have to live with a roommate. If you have a child, there's no way for you to make a living for yourself in that single person income household. And so it was quite a difficult thing to learn about. And you can imagine that probably things haven't gotten much better or changed a whole lot since this book was written. But the reason I bring this about is because participant observers are a real interesting form of qualitative data. This lady went and worked and lived like these people. And so it is a very useful and interesting and exciting source of data, but it's also important to be careful about it because you can't be totally objective as a participant observer, right? If you're going to work at Walmart, not only are you going to be able to say what it's like, but you're not going to be able to be objective. And so you maybe she described the conditions as being worse than they actually were because she felt emotionally connected to her coworkers who were having a hard time. Or maybe she actually painted the picture more positively than she should have because she didn't want to feel as though things were that terrible. It's hard to say, and the important thing is not necessarily to be accurate, but to be aware that those can be problems. If you ask someone who is a part of a religion to tell you about that religion, you're going to get good information, but it might not be 100% accurate because they're going to want to talk positively about their religion. If you talk to someone who left the military because they had a bad experience, you can get good information from them, but again, it might not be perfectly accurate because they're going to want to talk negatively since they had a bad experience and that's why they left. The last group here, or the last example option I'm giving you, are focus groups. Focus groups, I'm sure, are a type of qualitative data that you may have heard about before. It's where you interview people in a group. Now, focus groups are used very commonly for companies or politicians to learn what people's opinions are about a thing. So they might say, okay, my new catchphrase is ba 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 ba, catch me if you can, or something like that. Um, and so they would have people say, well, I think that catchphrase is interesting. I think that catchphrase is exciting. I think that catchphrase is rude, and I'm not interested in it. So focus groups are an interesting form of qualitative data because you can get large amounts of opinions at the same time, but you're also going to get a suite of validity issues. For example, people who go to focus groups are going to get paid. And so they may say whatever it is they feel like they need to say in order to get paid. Maybe they're afraid to say the negative stuff about what you're giving them. Another thing is that in a group of people, you're going to act differently than you do on your own. So it could be that your opinion is not totally honest. If someone says, if someone goes to a focus group about foot cream, and maybe they don't really want to give their honest opinion about their feet because that's kind of personal, maybe kind of gross, and so they might just go with whatever the group says. And so validity issues could be a problem there. And I really want to turn to validity issues here, the last part for this section. With qualitative data, anytime you're gathering qualitative data, you're going to want to worry about the validity of the data. I know I've mentioned it over and over and over again, so I'll go over some quick points here briefly. First, consider the accuracy of the data. Is a person being honest? Is a person capable of being honest? Was a person an unreliable narrator, someone that you can't trust? Is a person trying to give a different image of themselves or of a series of events than what actually happened? In generalizability, if you interview someone and they give you a perfect account of what happened in their lives, how well can we trust that to be accurate or true or reasonable for other people? A lot of folks will defend spanking children by saying, well, I spanked my children, I got spanked while I was growing up and I came out okay, therefore spanking must be good for other people. And that's really not necessarily the case. Just because spanking worked in one situation doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in a future situation. And on top of that, how can a person say that spanking worked with them versus exclusively a talking-based upbringing or discipline? You don't know because that's not what they experienced, and so they're never going to be able to be totally objective there. And so finally, that last point of objectivity is really what you want to be careful about with qualitative data. Can people give you good information? Just like in quantitative research, we have to be careful about our hypotheses because we will probably be looking to confirm our hypotheses. With qualitative data, people are going to probably want to defend their ways of life or the things that they've done and the choices that they've made. So you're going to be careful about objectivity there, not just on your end as the researcher, but on the participant's end as the interviewee or the focus group participant. All right, so most of the information here, this validity stuff, is going to repeat over in the next couple of sections. I'm going to try to avoid repeating myself too much, but in the next sections we'll learn about historical data and case studies, and they'll actually be quite short. So get ready for that, and I'll see you in a bit.